Imagine stepping into a Roman palace at midnight. Torchlight flickers across marble halls, perfumed smoke hangs thick in the air. Behind closed doors, whispers of silk and shuffling sandals echo in the shadows. And there, on velvet couches, emperors recline, surrounded not just by women but by young men and boys, their bodies chosen, purchased, and paraded as living ornaments of power. For centuries, the Roman Empire projected an image of discipline, order, and conquest. Gladiators fought to the death for honor, legions marched with unbreakable precision, and emperors boasted of justice and civilization. But beneath the shining marble veneer lay a world of shadows, where the empire's most powerful men indulged in desires hidden from public life, and where human beings, often teenage boys, were reduced to concubines, stripped of choice, and forced to serve the carnal whims of rulers who saw themselves as gods. This is not the Rome you read about in textbooks. This is not the story told in patriotic myths or heroic films. This is the Rome of secrecy, humiliation, and a twisted form of luxury. And tonight we're pulling back the curtain, because behind the triumphal arches and the golden statues there was a horrific reality, a reality where male concubines were collected like trophies, used as tools of dominance and discarded when their youth faded. If you enjoy hidden truths like this, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. But first, let's step deeper into the Empire of Shadows. To understand the horrific reality of male concubinage in Rome, we have to first understand Roman culture itself. Rome prided itself on being a civilization of laws, hierarchies, and masculine virtue. Yet, like every empire, its grandeur was built on contradictions. The Roman Republic, before it became an empire, often stressed simplicity, discipline, and restraint. Senators were expected to avoid excess, and soldiers lived with strict codes. But when Augustus became Rome's first emperor in 27 BCE, a new age of absolute power began. The emperor was no longer just a politician, he was the embodiment of Rome itself, answerable to no one but the gods. And with this unchecked authority came appetites unchecked by law. Sex in ancient Rome was not simply about desire, it was about power. Unlike modern societies where sexuality is tied to identity, Rome saw it as a hierarchy. To be dominant in sex, active, penetrating, was a symbol of masculinity and power. To be submissive, especially as a man, was considered degrading. And yet emperors and elites often blurred these boundaries, forcing slaves, prisoners, and even citizens into roles that humiliated them, while glorifying the emperor's dominance. Concubinage, the keeping of unofficial partners outside of marriage, became widespread among Rome's wealthy. For women, it was often a matter of politics or family alliances. For men, particularly male concubines, it was far more brutal. Boys, often captured from conquered territories or sold into slavery, were trained, dressed, and presented to their masters as objects of pleasure. Some were castrated to preserve their youthful looks, their voices forever frozen in adolescence. The most infamous emperors, Caligula, Nero, Elagabalus, used their palaces not just as political centers but as theaters of excess. They filled their halls with lovers, both male and female, often in humiliating displays meant to remind Rome that they could do whatever they pleased. These emperors blurred the lines between personal indulgence and public spectacle. But make no mistake, concubines were not lovers in the modern sense. They were property. A male concubine's life was one of constant danger. If he displeased his master, he could be beaten, discarded, or killed. If he grew too old, he would be replaced by someone younger, prettier, and more compliant. And yet, some concubines became favored companions, holding influence not because of respect, but because of how closely they lived to absolute power. This system thrived in part because Rome's economy was built on slavery. By some estimates, nearly 1/3 of Rome's population were slaves. They were war captives, debtors, or the children of slaves themselves. And within that massive population, the most vulnerable, the young and beautiful, were singled out for use in ways that today we would call abuse, but in Rome were seen as natural extensions of ownership. Imagine being a boy in the provinces, watching Roman soldiers storm your city. You're taken, chained, marched across continents, and sold in a market where your body is evaluated like livestock. Then, purchased by a wealthy Roman, you're dressed in fine clothes, perfumes applied, and presented before an emperor who sees you as nothing more than another jewel in his collection. The hypocrisy is staggering. Rome celebrated its gods as paragons of virtue, yet its emperors often played God by reshaping the lives of those they owned. The same empire that built aqueducts, roads, and libraries also created hidden harems of boys, where humanity was erased in the name of desire. And yet, in the eyes of many Romans, this was not scandal, it was accepted. For the empire that prided itself on conquest, taking human beings as concubines was just another form of victory. But that acceptance would soon collide with obsession, and when obsession ruled an emperor's heart, history was dragged into darkness. Among the most infamous stories of male concubinage in Rome is that of Emperor Nero. Born in 37 CE, Nero rose to power at the age of 16, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. At first, he was guided by advisors, his mother Agrippina and the philosopher Seneca, but soon his darker instincts took control. Nero was obsessed with performance. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, even an actor. But behind his stagecraft lay an obsession with controlling not just audiences but people, and no story illustrates this more horrifically than his relationship with a young boy named Sporus. Sporus was a beautiful slave boy whose delicate features and youth caught Nero's attention. To Nero, Sporus was not just a concubine, he was an obsession. After the emperor had his own wife Poppaea killed in a fit of rage, he reportedly sought to replace her, not with another woman, but with Sporus. Nero had the boy castrated to preserve his youthful appearance and forced him into a grotesque parody of marriage. Dressed in women's clothing, paraded as an empress, Sporus became the living doll of an emperor who saw human beings as toys for his fantasies. The story of Sporus is not unique, it is emblematic. Emperors had the power to reshape lives at will. To Nero, Sporus was no longer a person. He was a symbol, a reflection of Nero's power to bend flesh and identity itself to his will. For the Roman elite, concubinage was entertainment. For the concubines, it was survival. But for those chosen by the emperor himself, survival often came at the cost of everything: family, freedom, dignity. This rise of indulgence, obsession, and unchecked cruelty would mark a turning point not only in Nero's life, but in the empire's moral decay, because soon indulgence would become madness. Nero's treatment of Sporus was more than grotesque indulgence. It was the moment when the boundaries of power, pleasure, and cruelty fully dissolved in the Roman Empire. To understand how deeply this turning point reverberated, we have to linger in the palace halls where Sporus's life was rewritten before the eyes of the Roman elite. The marriage between Nero and Sporus was no quiet affair. It was staged as a public spectacle. Rome, after all, thrived on theatre, and Nero demanded that his private fantasies be treated with the same grandeur as a triumphal parade. Sporus was dressed in fine silks, adorned with jewels, and paraded in public as the emperor's wife. The Roman court, senators, generals, noblemen, were forced to watch in silence as the emperor made mockery of both marriage and masculinity. To laugh, to sneer, to even look away at the wrong moment could mean death. In this grotesque theatre, Sporus became the ultimate symbol of Rome's corruption. A child moulded into a queen, a slave forced into parody, a concubine stripped of even the dignity of his own name. He was not Sporus anymore. He was Nero's fantasy, an ornament to be displayed. For the Romans watching, horror mixed with complicity. Many despised Nero's extravagance, but they were powerless to stop him. The Senate was cowed, the Praetorian Guard corrupted, and the people silenced by fear. The emperor's lusts became law, and his whims, no matter how perverse, reshaped lives. It was not just Nero. Other emperors before and after him also indulged in such practices, but Nero's union with Sporus crystallized the reality of male concubinage in the empire. It showed how the line between political theatre and private abuse could vanish under the shadow of absolute power. But for Nero, Sporus was more than a concubine. He was a fixation, a haunting echo of what Nero had destroyed. Some ancient historians whisper that Nero saw in Sporus the ghost of Poppaea, his beloved wife whom he had killed in a fit of rage. By forcing Sporus into her image, Nero attempted to erase his guilt, but instead he created a nightmare that chained them both. Sporus, meanwhile, had no escape. He could not resist. Resistance meant death. He could not flee. The empire itself was Nero's hunting ground. And so, Sporus lived in a gilded prison, his every step a reminder that he was both cherished and owned, loved and enslaved, celebrated and degraded. The turning point came not only for Sporus, but for Rome itself. By the mid-60s CE, Nero's reign was spiraling into madness. He had bankrupted the treasury on games, palaces, and indulgences. He had executed senators, generals, even family members who threatened his power. The people whispered in the streets, the Senate seethed in silence, and rebellions brewed in the provinces. Yet, even as the empire cracked beneath him, Nero clung to Sporus as if the boy could fill the void left by his collapsing world. When the Great Fire of Rome erupted in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered it. While the city smoldered, he staged performances, singing about the fall of Troy while thousands of Romans were left homeless. And in the ashes, he built his golden house, a sprawling palace decorated with marble, gold, and artificial lakes. Within its chambers, Sporus was paraded like a jewel, the empress of a burning empire. It is here, at the heart of Nero's golden house, that Rome's nightmare becomes clearest. The empire's wealth, stolen from conquered lands, was poured into palaces where slaves like Sporus lived not as men, but as objects. The very stones of the empire were laid upon the broken backs of those who had no voice. The turning point was not simply Nero's obsession, it was Rome's surrender. The Senate allowed it, the people watched it. The empire, which once boasted of discipline and republican virtue, now bent beneath the weight of a boy in a dress, humiliated on a stage of marble and fire. And yet, the wheel of fate was turning. Rebellion spread. Generals rose against Nero. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, turned their loyalties. In 68 CE, cornered and abandoned, Nero fled the city that once adored him. But he did not flee alone. By his side, forced still into the role of empress, was Sporus. When Nero realized his end was near, he turned to Sporus in a chilling moment of intimacy. He demanded the boy sing his funeral dirge, as if the concubine who had been forced to live as a wife would now also preside over his death. Nero stabbed himself, ending his reign in blood and chaos. But for Sporus, there was no freedom in the emperor's death. Instead, he was passed like an inheritance. The boy who had been paraded as an empress was now seized by another powerful Roman, Otho, one of Nero's rivals and eventual short-lived emperor. Sporus's nightmare did not end, it only changed masters, and soon yet another emperor, Vitellius, demanded Sporus perform in a grotesque parody of his own marriage. The turning point of Nero's obsession thus revealed something more terrifying. Emperors could die, but the system of concubinage remained. The lives of boys like Sporus were not theirs to claim. They were currency, power, entertainment, and Rome, for all its glory, allowed it. What began as indulgence had become a cycle, and that cycle would only grow darker. Because if the turning point was obsession, the consequences were horror. The story of Sporus did not end with Nero's death. In fact, his suffering deepened. What makes his life so haunting is not just the cruelty of one emperor, but the way Rome's system allowed that cruelty to outlive its creator. When Nero fell, Sporus became a prize. To possess him was to inherit part of Nero's legacy, to wield a fragment of the strange and twisted intimacy that had defined the fallen emperor's court. Almost immediately, Otho, an ambitious noble who had once been Nero's ally, took Sporus as his own. To Otho, the boy was more than a concubine. He was a symbol, proof that he had stepped into Nero's shadow and claimed what Nero left behind. But Otho's reign was brief, lasting only a few months before Vitellius, another general, seized power. And with that shift, Sporus's nightmare continued. Vitellius demanded that Sporus appear in a public ceremony that was equal parts humiliation and theatre. According to historians, he intended to force Sporus to play the role a bride in a grotesque parody of Roman marriage, mocking both Nero's obsessions and Sporus's own existence. For Sporus, this was no longer just about survival. It was about being trapped in an endless cycle of abuse, passed like property from one emperor to another, his body and identity rewritten at their command. But Sporus's fate is only one example. Across Rome, countless boys and young men lived lives like his, unrecorded, unnamed, their stories lost to time. They were war captives from Gaul, Greece, the Middle East and North Africa, chosen for their youth, their beauty, their vulnerability. Some were kept in private villas, others in hidden chambers of palaces. Many were castrated to preserve the features that made them desirable, their futures stolen with the slash of a knife. Imagine the psychological toll, a child torn from his family, stripped of his name, dressed in silks, forced to smile and serve while every glance carried the threat of death. Survival meant submission, resistance meant ruin. Rome's obsession with concubinage reveals a deeper truth. The empire's power was not just military or political, it was personal. To command armies was one thing, to command bodies was another. The emperor's harem of concubines, male and female alike, was a theatre of absolute dominance. Every slave in those chambers was a reminder that the emperor was not bound by law, morality, or even nature itself. But this indulgence carried consequences, not only for the concubines but for Rome itself. Emperors distracted by their harems often neglected the state. Nero bankrupted the treasury with his extravagances. Elagabalus, another infamous emperor, spent more time arranging marriages between himself and his male lovers than commanding his armies. These obsessions weakened Rome's leadership, eroding the discipline that had once made the empire strong. And as emperors indulged, resentment grew. Roman elites whispered that their rulers were no longer men of virtue, but slaves to their desires. Satirists mocked them in secret, describing the palaces as brothels, the emperors as madmen, and the empire itself as diseased. To the Roman people, who had once prided themselves on stern virtue, the sight of emperors parading concubines like spouses was a sign that Rome had lost its soul. The human consequences, though, were far worse. Concubines lived in constant fear of violence. Many were beaten, mutilated, or discarded when they grew too old. Those who fell out of favor could be executed in moments of paranoia. Their lives were entirely dependent on the whims of their masters. Some concubines, like Sporus, were remembered because of their proximity to power. Most were forgotten, their suffering unrecorded, their names lost to history. But perhaps the darkest consequence was the way Rome normalized this horror. To Romans, it was not scandalous for emperors to keep boys as concubines, it was expected. Power meant indulgence, and indulgence meant ownership of other human beings. The moral outrage we feel today simply did not exist in the same form. The empire's laws, customs, and culture all conspired to make concubinage appear natural, even inevitable. This normalization reveals something chilling about Rome. Its cruelty was not hidden in shadows but paraded in daylight. The forced marriage of Sporus was not conducted in secret. It was staged before senators, generals, and citizens. Everyone saw, everyone knew, and almost no one spoke out, because to resist the emperor was to invite destruction. The empire's grandeur, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the triumphal arches, was built alongside its horrors, and for every emperor celebrated in marble, there were concubines like Sporus, their bodies and souls broken, their stories buried beneath the weight of empire. As Rome descended into crisis after crisis, civil wars, assassinations, invasions, the treatment of concubines remained unchanged. They were still captured, still sold, still mutilated, still used. Their suffering became a silent thread woven through the centuries of Rome's rise and fall. And in that silence lies the true horror, that the empire which boasted of law, order, and civilization also accepted the most intimate forms of violence as normal. The consequences of this cruelty were not just personal, not just political, they were civilizational. Rome's decline was fueled not only by external enemies but by internal decay, a rot that began at the very heart of its leadership. And at the heart of that rot were stories like Sporus's. Stories of boys who should have been sons, brothers, citizens, yet became empresses, concubines, and victims. Rome's darkness did not end with their lives. It left scars across history. But what happened after, when the empire collapsed, when the emperors fell, what became of the truth? That takes us into the aftermath. When Nero took his own life in 68 CE, the boy he had paraded as an empress did not find freedom. Sporus was swept into the chaos of Rome's Year of the Four Emperors, a bloody civil war in which generals and senators clawed at the imperial throne. Passed from Otho to Vitellius, forced into grotesque ceremonies, mocked and displayed, Sporus's very existence was a reminder of how Rome's most powerful men treated human beings as disposable theatre props. According to later accounts, Sporus's end came in despair. Facing the humiliations demanded by Vitellius, he took his own life. After years of being stripped of choice, his final act was the only decision he could make for himself. A boy once dressed as a bride, a slave once called an empress, chose death over further degradation. His story flickers through ancient texts, brief, almost an afterthought, yet the silence around it says more than any words could. For every Sporus recorded, there were countless others erased, their suffering never written. The aftermath of Rome's obsession with concubinage was not measured only in broken lives, but in the corrosion of its moral foundation. Emperors came and went, Domitian, Commodus, Elagabalus, each notorious in their own ways for indulging private fantasies at the expense of their people. Elagabalus, in the 3rd century, openly kept male lovers, even attempting to marry one of them in ceremonies that scandalized the elite. Like Nero, he blurred the lines between emperor and actor, between ruler and abuser, until assassination ended his reign. The empire lurched on for centuries, powerful but fragile, its leaders consumed by indulgence even as enemies pressed at the borders. For many historians, Rome's treatment of concubines reflects the same arrogance that would eventually undo it, the belief that conquest justified everything, that dominance excused cruelty, that human beings could be broken and remade for pleasure. But what lesson do we 2 millennia later take from this? Perhaps the most chilling truth is that Rome was not unique. Throughout history, empires have hidden their brutality behind grandeur. Palaces glitter while slaves suffer in silence. Victories are carved into stone while the voices of the conquered vanish into dust. The concubines of Rome remind us that behind every golden facade there are shadows, human lives erased so that power may shine brighter. And yet there is something profoundly human in the fragments that survive. Sporus, though broken by the empire, still resisted in the only way left to him. His suicide was a tragic assertion of agency in a world that had stolen everything from him. It reminds us that even in the darkest systems, the human spirit strains against chains, even if it cannot break them. When we walk through Roman ruins today, we see arches, columns, mosaics. We marvel at their beauty, their endurance. But beneath those stones, It's lie invisible histories, the lives of the enslaved who built them, the concubines who cried in silence behind palace walls, the boys who were paraded as brides in grotesque games of power. Rome's glory was always built on their suffering. The lesson is not merely historical, it is moral. Civilizations rise when they respect human dignity and they crumble when cruelty is normalized. Rome's emperors believed their power was eternal, but the empire that once spanned continents fell. Its monuments cracked, its armies scattered, its emperors remembered more for their excess than their virtue. And yet the stories of those who suffered, like Sporus, remain as warnings etched into history. You might wonder, why does this matter today? Because power, unchecked, always repeats itself. The faces change, the palaces change, the justifications change, but the temptation to treat human beings as objects never disappears. When leaders, rulers, or societies place pleasure above dignity, indulgence above justice, cruelty above compassion, they walk the same path Rome did. So, the horrific reality of male concubines in the Roman Empire is not just a story about the past, it's a mirror. A reminder that civilization is fragile, that behind every empire's triumphal march there may be victims hidden in the shadows, silenced but not forgotten. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all, somewhere in the ruins of Rome, a ghost still lingers. The ghost of a boy who once walked in silk, called an empress against his will, and who chose death over another day of humiliation. Sporus does not speak, but his silence screams across the centuries. His story demands that we look at Rome not only for its grandeur but for its cruelty, not only for its victories but for its victims. Only then do we see the full truth. So, as you step away from the marble and the myths, remember the shadows, remember the concubines who lived and died unseen, and remember that the measure of a civilization is not in its monuments, but in how it treats its most vulnerable. Subscribe for more, share this story, and tell me in the comments what shocked you most.